So, good morning everybody. Today I'm going to talk to you about drug repurposing as a strategy for rare disease charities. And this is really an important introduction to our workshop today. What I hope to achieve firstly is to make sure everyone's on the same playing field, understanding what repurposing actually is and how it's important for rare diseases. And then secondly, to think more on a big picture scale. So if we're going to go about doing a drug repurposing project, what are the things we should consider? How should we make sure this is the right approach for us? And how do we make sure the drug that we ultimately deliver is right for the patient as well? So it's something we've been working on at Findacure for quite a while, particularly an area that I started in a charity, because we really do believe this is an approach that can make things much quicker and cheaper, and that can only be good for rare diseases, and that's hopefully what I'll convince you at the start of my talk. So point one, the slide I show a million talks, it feels like, that I've given is what is drug repurposing? And very simply, drug repurposing really is recycling. It's about taking some kind of medication or drug that's prescribed and approved to treat one specific illness, sometimes known as an indication, and trying to run clinical trials to gather evidence to show that this drug can be useful, effective, or what's called efficacious for a completely different type of illness. In an ideal world, what you want to do is get a full marketing approval, marketing authorization for that new illness. That means you've taken the evidence, you've gone to regulators like the FDA in America or the EMA in Europe and said this body of evidence we've collected suggests that this drug really is effective, really is beneficial to patients. Will you give us a license to sell it for this new condition? And that isn't always a route that you can reach with repurposing, particularly for rare diseases. But what is really crucial is collecting that different evidence to really allow you to use drugs more effectively for a wider number of patients, to really make sure we're making the most of the drugs that are currently available to us. So it sounds good, but it doesn't necessarily always sound interesting. When you talk about drug repurposing to different people, they'll look at you maybe with a glazed expression, because it doesn't sound big, exciting, or sexy science, if you like. In a world right now that's dominated by de novo drug discovery, by the desire to find a completely new, exciting chemical to treat something, that sounds like a really impactful, exciting thing. Genomics is obviously cutting-edge science now, looking at the entirety of our genes, our whole genome, to understand the makeup of us, and that has led to this new field of personalised medicine, a situation where we're trying to find a specific drug to treat a specific illness that a specific individual has. And down the line, that again opens up that world, potentially of gene editing, of actually going into the DNA, into the genome itself, and changing its makeup so that you can remove the mutations or the causative problems of illness and completely free people from it. These are the big, exciting topics, and when those things are out there, people tend to ask, why would I bother with repurposing? I like my medicines new and innovative. Well, firstly, I'd say recycling. Repurposing is innovative. It's finding a new way to use an existing drug. That new part is innovation. It's being more effective with what's already out there, and that shouldn't be shunned. Secondly, it's fundamentally true that there needs to be a different approach within the pharmaceutical industry. Here we can see data that looks at the productivity of the pharmaceutical industry going from 1996 to 2013. So it's not new data, but there's important trends and patterns we can see here. On the red bars, we see the number of new drugs that have been approved, and we see in 96 that was annually over 50, dropping significantly down in the following years. There's a downward trend in these red bars. So we're looking at around less than 30 drugs approved in 2013. In the green bar, what we see is the R&D spend, the research and development spend in US billions of dollars during those years. So while we've got a decrease generally in the number of drugs that are being approved annually, we have a clear increase in the amount that's been spent to do that. So what we're seeing is a reduction in efficiency. We're spending more money to produce less stuff. Again, that's stabilising in later years, but what this clearly shows us is that the cost of each new drug is increasing year on year. And we can see in 96 an average cost of around $0.3 billion to produce a drug. In 2013, we see $1.8 billion to produce that new drug. We're getting less effective, less efficient in producing new medicines in the de novo drug discovery of the pharmaceutical industry. This is a problem. This tells us we need to do something different to make sure we're delivering the new treatments that patients need. In rare diseases, that problem is even more compounded by the individual severity of each condition, there is a small market within which to sell your rare disease drug. And this means you have to find a way to make that business model effective. And if you're spending 1.8 billion on a drug, even if it is for a small patient population, a point we might debate, then you need to recoup that investment through selling the drug at a higher price. And that's what this graph shows. What you can see in the pale blue are the price of orphan drugs per patient per year in dollars, and in the darker bars you have the non-orphan drugs. And say in 2016 you can see an average price of just below $28,000 per patient per year for a non-orphan drug, a drug for a common illness, with a price of over $140,000 per patient per year for that rare disease orphan drug. A huge disparity in pricing. This is potentially manageable because you're selling very few drugs to individual patients, so it's not a huge budgetary impact to any one given rare condition. However, when you roll this out across multiple different rare conditions and the ever-increasing number of orphan drugs that are reaching market, what you're basically seeing is a really high price to treat orphan patients that's becoming a burden on health providing systems. And it's going to be a problem we need to deal with more actively in the future. So, alongside these two problems, there's also the innate problem of rare diseases themselves. If you're working to treat a rare disease, it is clearly challenging. It's challenging for lots of different reasons. There are a small number of researchers or clinicians working on any given condition. The patient population itself is very small, but also fragmented. It's broken up and isolated in small pockets around the world or a country. Because of that lack of research effort and the difficulty in finding patients to study, we have a limited understanding of disease natural history in general. We don't quite know how a disease might progress from year to year in many cases. And further, because of a lack of treatment options or any care whatsoever, we don't quite know how the disease might progress when patients do begin living longer with it. So we don't know what comorbidities might develop. So that understanding can really hamper our development. There are fundamentally limited knowledge of the disease pathway, so what actually causes underlying conditions and the mechanisms that make it function. And generally there are no existing treatments, and often there's not even a clinical care pathway in place, so no real prescribed route of how to manage patients with the condition. And all of this makes it really hard to get started in research. With all of that burden of unknowns, it's obvious that if you've got a burden of unknowns about your condition, if you can reduce the unknowns about the drug that you're working with to try and target it, it's going to make life easier. So in rare diseases, because it's already hard to work in rare, why not use drugs where we have a high degree of knowledge, because that can actually make the problem more simple. Keep the unknowns in the condition and remove those unknowns from drug development and treatment. And that's certainly why drug repurposing could be an effective option in rare conditions. So what are the other benefits of repurposing? Fundamentally, it's what I've just said. It's about working with something that you know. This can ultimately allow you to develop treatments more quickly, more cheaply, and that can only be good for rare diseases for the aforementioned reasons. So in repurposing, we remove the need for de novo drug discovery. That's a really time-consuming and expensive process. You're trying to completely create a new chemical entity to treat humans, and you have to work out what impact it has on the body in every different way. If you haven't got to do that in repurposing, you're working with a drug that exists. It saves a huge amount of time and money. You have a known safety profile and known side effects with a repurposed drug, and if that drug is already widely available or generic, you have a long history of human use. And this means you know about a safety profile, probably in different patient populations of different age groups and different conditions. So it gives you much more insight into what that drug does within the body. What this can mean is it reduces your requirement for early stage clinical trials. You don't have to do as many phase 1 tests, you can move more quickly into phase 2, more quick, more cheap drug development. You also, with repurposing, know about the pathways of action of the drug. You know where it targets things in the body or the cell. This means you have ideas or evidence for different repurposing candidates. So rather than going to screen 10,000, even 1,000 different drugs to see if they might work on your favourite disease model, you can actually look at the information you have about disease pathway, match intelligently existing drugs to act on that pathway, and screen 100, or 20 different drugs that have potential to affect that target. And this again reduces your costs and increases your speed. It makes finding a potential candidate much more simple. And that's what we want to do in drug repurposing for rare conditions. So hopefully all this convinces you that repurposing is great for rare conditions. It's something we should be exploring. But the question then for us is, how do we go about delivering a repurposed drug to patients themselves? How do we find a way to take that concept to our patients? Now, in repurposing, there are 3 different targets that we should think about looking at. 3 different pools, if you like, of drugs to be recycled. The first group are existing generic drugs. So a generic drug is a drug that's no longer affected by a patent, so it can effectively be produced by multiple companies because the chemical structure of that drug is no longer protected. So what this means is it's probably much more available on the market potentially, and it's probably been used for many different existing illnesses. This is a nice target for repurposing because there's a wealth of information out there. Of course, some generics may no longer be produced widely because they're not the main frontline treatment anymore, or they might stop production because they're deemed to be less profitable. So there are issues when you're in that generic space, but the potential is quite rich for repurposing. The other 2 pools of repurposing candidates fall within the under-patent drugs. So these are drugs that are still benefiting from some kind of patent, some kind of marketing exclusivity, which might be a patent, might be from an orphan drug designation. So essentially what this means is they can only be produced or marketed by a specific company. The first pool is obvious. Those are current branded compounds, so compounds with a name that are made by one company for a specific indication, a specific illness. And we can target these to hopefully move them into different areas, and that might be an appealing business model for the company that makes the drug. The second are shelved compounds. These are compounds that are sitting in kind of chemical libraries within pharmaceutical companies. Things that they found were safe to use in humans, but they chose not to develop further, and that might be because they didn't show a high degree of efficacy or effectiveness in the condition they were developing a drug for. It might be simply that they didn't see an effective business model to develop the drug and continue it. But this is a wealth of interesting chemicals that could potentially be repurposed, repositioned into new areas, and really drive things forward for their development process and hopefully for new treatments in rare conditions. So when we're thinking about how do we drive a treatment to patients, we need to think about these different targets and consider what the advantages and disadvantages are of working with under-patent drugs or generic drugs, and understand those advantages when we know what our own target is. So if a drug is under patent, you have an obvious route to approach an industry partner to develop the drug for your condition. Someone holds the patent, they're the person you're going to have to go to. Potentially for them, there's a clear business benefit to repurpose that drug as well, i.e. if it's successful, you can have a larger market for your drug. You're going to make more money essentially from selling it. What you have to hope is the cost of development are substantially lower than the cost, than the money that they can bring in from selling it. There are cons though, of course. You actually have to convince them of this. You have to convince the patent owner to either allow you to work on the drug or to develop it themselves. And what we're generally seeing in the world of repurposing, having effective clinical evidence of effect is really key to how making these decisions work. If you can go to a patent holder and show, well, actually, look, we've got this evidence that says your drug has a clinical benefit in humans based on a small open label trial or off-label use, that's going to be far more compelling and make them believe that it's worth the investment to develop that drug into that indication. If you have an idea developed from a computer software or even from animal models, they're probably less likely to take the step to make that development. The other con you have when working with an under-patent drug is that you have a limited understanding of safety in a wide range of patients. So you're never quite so sure how safe a drug might be in a different group. So you probably are going to have to do some extra safety tests with it, but that would go hand in hand effectively with working with a larger company. Now, this route is particularly worthwhile and effective when working with shelved compounds, and this is something that lots of big pharmaceutical companies are now getting involved with. They have what are called open innovation models. They take their shelved compound library and they basically have open calls for academics, for researchers, to begin to look at these compounds and use them in their experiments. What they're hoping is that those academics identify new uses for the drugs and lead them down a pipeline to develop that drug for market for entirely new patient populations. The academics apply to access the compound library, and in many cases they'll also receive some kind of research funding and support to their research. They go about trying to develop that drug into a completely different area. That will be a potentially rare condition or potentially common condition. Regardless, as they move through the process and get further away from basic bench science and into patients, the pharma company are likely to take on a bigger level of involvement, putting more assets in, putting more researchers onto the project with the aim of actually securing a marketing approval down the line for a new drug. This means they have a fully traditional model for recouping their investment. They sell the drug at a reasonably high price to recuperate that investment, and the academic institution will probably retain some small level of benefit from that as well, generating new treatments for potentially rare conditions. Now, if we look at working with a generic compound, there's different pros, and many pros actually. Firstly, you have lots of data on human use when you have a generic drug, because loads of people are taking the drug probably for different conditions. And that's going to help you understand the safety and understand the full range of side effects and targets of this drug. Because the drug can be more readily produced, you're going to have a lower cost in most cases, which means the drug is relatively easy to acquire for clinical trials and could potentially be provisioned at that low cost for patients. It's accessible for off-label use because it's widely available, made by lots of different folk, and cheap. And this really does make it ideal for a kind of academic-led clinical trial. Clinician-driven, research-driven, patient group-driven can really access generic drugs and use them in this setting and really lower the costs of drug for clinical trial. There are problems though, particularly with the business model. Because there is no intellectual property in the chemical itself, the only type of patent you can access, intellectual property, would be a mode of use patent. That's saying, I have the protection of using this drug to treat this illness. Now, unfortunately, these types of patents are quite hard to defend, and that's because drug prescriptions, generally speaking, and definitely in the UK, are simply prescription of the drug. They're not tied to condition. So that means a prescribing doctor can simply write a drug name and give that to a patient. They don't have to justify the use of a given drug. So if you're trying to sell your on-label version of a drug for a rare condition, and there is a perfectly identical generic form of that drug under a different name, the clinician can choose to prescribe that cheaper one. There's no recourse for you. So it's not seen as something that's defensible, and it's always a risk that off-label prescription would eat into the profits of a company, and this means it's not seen as a viable business model for big pharma. There are other challenges with working with generics as well, as if a non-viable business model wasn't enough. If you're working with a generic, your current formulation or delivery method for the drug might not be appropriate for your patient population. This is a double-edged sword. If that's the case, you have to go for what's called a reformulation. And this would mean you're creating a new chemical entity, essentially. This does give you intellectual property, so you do open up a more traditional business model, but you then lose the benefits of working with a generic because you have to go through the full safety profiling of the drug, which was one of the advantages of repurposing in the first place. The other challenge with working with generics is the fact that the drug can be taken, potentially, outside of clinical trials by patients. In rare conditions, this can be a particular challenge, as patients are really well informed and aware of what's happening in clinical trials and may be able to access the drug that you're trialling independently, buying it themselves privately, essentially. And this is very challenging, as it can invalidate any control arms in a clinical trial, but it also can mean that patients are taking a drug that hasn't yet really been validated and shown to be effective. And this can make clinical development very hard, particularly in a rare condition. So So as I said, if you need to change the formulation of your drug, you have pros and cons, and this is just highlighting that. For example, we see a random tablet here. You may need to change the formulation, so change the chemical makeup of the drug. That might be adding another compound in with it, changing the way it's packaged, changing something about the chemical structure subtly to change the way it targets the cells. That then is a new chemical entity. You gain IP, you need new safety data. You might change the dose, so make it much higher than is currently approved. And if you do that, again, the same problems. And thirdly, you might need to change the delivery method. So a tablet might not be effective to dose the lungs, for example, while the drug itself would work. It needs to be delivered in a different way. And again, it has the same function. And there are actually a lot of reformulation companies out there, companies that are looking at repurposing with reformulation as a way for them to secure IP and leverage that to secure more funding, more income from their new compounds. In many cases, this can really make the drug much better and more effective for the rare condition. So it's certainly an avenue to pursue, but you have to be aware of the pros and cons of it. So aside from looking at the entity itself and whether the drug we're trying to repurpose is currently generic or currently under patent, we also need to consider how we are trying to deliver that drug to the patients once we get it to a stage where we have evidence that it's working. And the two major delivery routes we could consider as patient organisations trying to drive repurposing are an off-label delivery route and an on-label delivery route. In off-label delivery, we're talking about delivering the drugs to patients without securing a marketing approval. Now, this is generally, fair to say, a less desirable option, but it might be a very sensible option for your patient organisation, and we'll discuss why that is in a moment. On an on-label route, you're going all out to secure that marketing authorisation, that approval, which essentially means you're able to sell the drug as a treatment for this given condition, and you can sell into the markets that licensing body works. So in Europe, you would try and get a license with it, the EMA, and that could then allow you to sell the drug for your condition to all the European countries. So why would you look at these different routes? Well, the pros of on-label are relatively clear. You secure a marketing authorisation, and that gives a route to reimbursement and uniform patient access in each country. So essentially, you have a licence. This is a stamp of approval that allows you to go to reimbursement bodies like NICE in the UK and try and secure payment for them from them for the drug. And this is going to make it far more likely that patients throughout the country will be able to access that drug. Throughout Europe will be able to access that drug. So you have that nice chance to really reach all patients that are diagnosed with the condition. The authorisation itself is also, it's a stamp of approval. It's showing you have robust evidence of efficacy, and there's also inbuilt monitoring of the safety of the drug as well. So it's really saying this is a gold standard approach to your repurposing. Now reaching this gold standard has problems, has cons. You're going to require a much higher level of evidence, which could be even higher if you want to secure reimbursement. Of course, reaching this gold standard of approval does require a higher degree of effort, and that itself can be a con in the process. So you need to generate a really high level of scientific evidence to prove that the drug is effective in your patient population. And when you're working with rare conditions, finding enough patients to test things on and building enough robust evidence can be very hard to do. That's obviously going to slow down the process and drive up the cost of the research. Furthermore, in rare conditions, what we're finding is the level of evidence that's needed to secure reimbursement, particularly for a high-value drug, is often higher than the evidence that's needed to secure a license with, say, the EMA. So there's a lot of more research work to do to get to this on-label stage. And as I say, this is going to lead to those longer, more costly clinical trials, and really going to need more industry expertise to deliver those trials. It's going to be harder to do this in an independent way without working with pharmaceutical companies. With the off-label use, you have a range of different benefits, which kind of are the flip side of that. What you're trying to do essentially is run clinical trials that are providing enough evidence of efficacy that are going to convince the clinicians that are really focusing on treating this condition that they should be able to provide the drug off-label. So you've got a targeted pool of clinicians you're trying to convince, and you're trying to build evidence to show this drug works. Think of it as an incremental step forward in your evidence generation. Rather than some clinicians thinking it works based on their experience, you have a good degree of scientific publication confirming that in a decent pool of patients. Generating this type of evidence has a low cost compared to a full-blown industry standard marketing authorization level clinical trial. You have shorter studies and you need less industry input or guidance. Because of that as well, you do have a chance to find a way to secure a low-cost generic drug price. You're not actually going out there to market the drug for a rare condition. So with a low enough, a smaller patient population, you're going to have a very marginal increase on a company's sales. You can just buy it at that low-cost generic price and have a very low-cost way of treating your condition. This sounds great, but it's clear that there are cons of this. You essentially have lower evidence of efficacy. You're basing it on a small study, and you don't have the inbuilt monitoring or safety without the marketing authorization platform. The other problem is down to access. Because you are doing this in an off-label prescription, your access will be patchy. And the more clinicians who are working with different patient, with your patient population, the more patchy it will be, because not all of them will be convinced by your evidence. And in many regions, off-label prescription may not be legal or may not be an option for those clinicians, so you'll be excluding patients within those jurisdictions from treatment as well. And there's always that chance that the drug might increase in price in response to the fact that there's increased sales, or equally cease to be produced because its original indication is no longer using it as a standard therapy of care, and that could then mean there's no access for patients after a certain point. So those are two things that really are very detrimental to the patient population. It means treatment would stop, or treatment would be blocked from patients who have previously received it, which is not a route you want to see. But clearly this route is something to consider when you have a very small patient population, when you're really going to struggle to deliver the type of research that you'd need for marketing authorization. There's just not really a business model in place to do it, because you are improving the situation for patients on what was there previously through the generation of scientific evidence. So how do these things kind of pan out together to lead to our strategic decisions? So if we think about how does it combine the delivery route that we're proposing to reach with the status of our repurposing candidate, we can get an idea about that. So if we're working with a generic drug, when we're aiming to get the drug prescribed to patients off-label, it's fair to say that it's unlikely we're going to see any pharmaceutical company involvement. And you're probably not going to be able to work with a reformulation either. So the drug you're working with has to work in the patient population you're after. You're going to need a lower degree of evidence to get to the stage where patients can reach it, but you'll also suffer from lesser uptake. Not all of your patients are likely to receive that drug. It's relatively quick and relatively inexpensive to deliver the scientific research needed to make this effective, and you have a chance to secure a low-priced drug for those patients who do access it. An example of this type of work will be the work of ALPS with the drug sirolimus. So this is a project that was completed with research funding from a repurposing charity, Cures Within Reach. So ALPS is autoimmune lymphoproliferative syndrome, and the patients themselves suffer from enlarged lymph nodes, which really leads to a high rate of infections and anemia, and the patients themselves spend as many as 5 to 10 days in hospital each month, which can be quite severe, and many will actually pass away. The repurposing charity Cures Within Reach decided to fund a single researcher to run a study of different repurposed drugs in a mouse model of ALPS. They found with one of those drugs it looked efficacious. It looked like it could have a big impact on ALPS itself. So they went on to provide further support for a pilot study, a simple clinical study in just 6 patients, testing the generic drug sirolimus within them. Now, within 90 days, 5 of the 6 patients that they treated were in complete remission. This is a really striking result, actually, and it's really important to note the very black and white nature of it, which makes it easy to move forward with. The results that they found were published in an open access journal with the aim of simply promoting off-label use within ALPS patients. And monitoring and treatment is ongoing in the literature. But more patients are accessing it as a consequence of this, and they're having profound results and outcomes. So Cures Within Reach estimate that this simple study and the use of sirolimus that low generic cost, it saves around $50,000 per patient per year compared to the cost of their previous hospitalisations. And it hugely improves their health and quality of life. So it's really a successful story of this type of generic off-label repurposing. Now, if we're looking to be off-label and we're looking at an under-patent drug, things are going to be quite challenging. Pharmaceutical companies can't work off-label at all. They're completely prohibited from doing it because they can't promote a drug they don't hold a license for. And this is going to make it very hard for you to do research. It's going to be hard to access the drug to run the trial itself. If you manage to do that, you'll obviously need lower evidence, but you will need to reach clinicians to effectively do that. But you're still going to have the high price of the drug because the drug price won't be licensed, it's not going to change. So you're going to be accessing a high price drug with less evidence for its use, and that's going to make it, again, less likely you're going to have a high uptake if you even manage to run the trials themselves. So it's really a space you're going to struggle to work in truth. Now, if we're looking at generic drugs and trying to get an on-label treatment, you certainly could use pharmaceutical collaboration for the project, and you have potential to look at reformulation, changing the drug in some way to maybe be better targeted or better suited to delivery to your patient population. You will need to generate strong evidence to secure the marketing authorization. There's nothing wrong with that, but that is going to lead to a longer process and higher costs for the research. And as a consequence, it's likely the drug price will be higher than it would be if you were using a purely generic route. Again, this isn't necessarily a problem as long as the price is controlled to some degree. It could still be highly accessible for your patient population and far more efficacious. If you're looking to work in an on-label space with a drug that's under patent, you actually have quite an interesting opportunity because pharmaceutical collaboration is quite likely, as there's a really valid business model out there, provided they're convinced that the investment in the research is worth the effort. You'll need to generate strong evidence, but you will ultimately delay the generic takeover for the company, and that's worth a huge amount to them. That is likely to lead to the drug price staying at whatever the current market value is, however. So an example of that is the work of the use or repurposing, rather, of everolimus for tuberous sclerosis. So this research began completely with academic fundamental science, where researchers were trying to identify the underlying mechanism of tuberous sclerosis, and that their work was funded by a patient organisation. What they managed to do was identify the mTOR pathway as a major issue within the rare disease. But not only by doing that, they also identified a series of drugs that could work on that pathway, mTOR inhibitors. From there, they were interested in taking things further. They wanted to run a simple in-human trial to test the effect of mTOR pathway inhibitors in patients with tuberous sclerosis and see if they could stop the formation of more tumours or even revert existing tumours. But unfortunately, funding for a full academic-led trial was rejected by the MRC, so they couldn't use a generic drug in an academic-driven clinical trial. At this point, you would often see things stopping. There'll be no further research into this idea. Luckily for the researchers and TSC patients, the Tuberous Sclerosis Association decided to put some funding in to run this trial in association with government funding they got from the Welsh Government. And this helped to deliver an open label phase 2 trial in kidney tumours for tuberous sclerosis. And it generated evidence of efficacy in patients. This evidence of efficacy was enough to get the interest of a big pharma company, Novartis, who produced an on-label version of the drug, everolimus itself. They decided, based on the impact, the effect that was shown in humans in the clinical trial, to fund a large international phase 3 study of everolimus for tuberous sclerosis. And this drug is under patent. So Novartis essentially were able to secure an orphan drug designation for everolimus, to run clinical trials and access the benefits of orphan drug designation for the drug. And this extended their marketing exclusivity for a long time, out to 2021. I believe in the research I did that the patent for the drug originally expired in 2013, so that's a huge extension of their marketing exclusivity for all the indications everolimus is treating. Luckily, their international clinical trial was effective, and it means that Novartis have been able to develop this drug for a number of different sub-indications of tuberous sclerosis. Patients are now accessing it regularly on the NHS within the UK and across the world. And the cost isn't hugely high. It's estimated at around 36,000 per patient per year in the UK. That number, again, could vary, but is nowhere near the 140 odd thousand mark we saw as the average for orphan drugs. However, it is worth noting that if that original academic trial could have been funded, could have been successful, and could have secured a way of using the generic drug, the estimated cost there is possibly as low as £250 per patient per year. So a huge disparity once again between the generic and the label price. But it's fair to say that this route has delivered something really meaningful for patients with tuberous sclerosis and really beneficial for the pharmaceutical partner. So, in summary, traditional drug discovery routes cannot deliver for rare diseases all on their own. That's really clear, and we need to find new routes to deliver treatments. And we really believe that repurposing offers a quicker, cheaper, and a purely collaborative route to development of effective treatments. Patient groups really can help to drive drug repurposing forward, but it's really important if you're getting involved in this area that you think carefully about the strategy beforehand. What type of drug are you going to be targeting to repurpose? How are you going to make it reach patients? And what does this mean? How can we deliver that project effectively? Who should we partner with? And what will that research, that project actually look like in the long term? And there really are many ways into the field of repurposing. And it's all about understanding the available evidence to you to give you the best hope to identify the opportunities that you need. And hopefully by doing this and clarifying your charity's aims, your patients' needs, will ensure you select the best strategy to deliver the drug that the patients need to them more quickly, more cheaply than traditional de novo drug discovery, and in many cases actually to allow something to happen for your patients when it otherwise would not without repurposing as a route. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to any questions.